Hey everybody, it's Bruce and the dog on the floor, and today we're going to talk about features that make LiveBook an excellent tool for a variety of scenarios. We're going to walk through some scenarios from using a LiveBook to work with prose and code in the context of, say, a book or a blog. We're going to look at LiveBook as a teaching tool, as a code documentation tool, and as a mechanism for sharing research. And what I'd like to do in this video is talk about the specific features in LiveView that make that easy to do. We're going to be working with a LiveBook that I installed this way. Mix escript.install hex LiveBook. That's all I need to do to install it. And after I have it installed, I've already run that one, but after I have it installed, all I have to do is type LiveBook server, and this is going to fly. And now all I need to do is point my browser here, and I'm off to the races. And next we can look at features that LiveBook is going to provide to make several important scenarios important to us. Let's just drop this URL right in like that. And I should note that we're using a token, but there are other opportunities to secure the LiveBook as well, and they all have strengths and weaknesses. I'll let you read about them in the project. But there are two ways that I could use this. I could load an existing LiveBook, so I could either click on a link, and there's a linking mechanism to link to these live pages or live projects. And then I could also import an existing LiveBook, and keep in mind that this is only a text format that essentially is a serialization of a LiveBook. It's called LiveMD, and it describes prose, code, and code output, and it has delimiters for each of those things that make these things easy to consume. So I could either get that from loading a URL or from a clipboard or from a file. We're not going to do that. We're going to create our own. And we're going to create one called scenarios. We're going to just point to a number of scenarios and some of the features that LiveBook has to enable those scenarios. And we're going to start doing that next. The four scenarios that we're going to look at, you could quibble about them, but I'm going to use these. I think that these are some of the reasons that LiveBook has grown beyond where it was initially created. And it was initially created to actually be a reporting and experimenting for data, especially in the area of data science, but not strictly in this area. Because really what happens when you start mixing code and data and prose is that you can sometimes get this confusing mix and wind up with something that's a little bit difficult to navigate if you're trying to do it from a code first or a data first direction. So what LiveBook gives us is a human-centric way to express things that have all three of these elements. And right now, this is the document. The document has a section, and it also has code. So I could have 1 + 1, and then I could evaluate this. And this evaluates to 2. These can get pretty sophisticated. And whether I'm dealing with simple math formulas or whether I'm dealing with data science experiments with Axon and NX, this mix unlocks a whole variety of user experiences that we haven't seen with just plain Elixir. And so this is the first scenario. Let's go on to the next one. I'm going to call this one books, blogs, and writing. And I'm going to distinguish between this particular scenario and project documentation, and I'll tell you why in a bit. I want to start here because the strength of this scenario is that it gives us some excellent tools that are already proven, namely Markdown for dealing with prose, and it allows us to mix in code that's locked down to a particular version, and it also helps us solve the formatting problem in a way that I don't have to solve it as a technical author. And I really love the promise of this kind of technology. In fact, I've already started experimenting with LiveBook for implementing and writing, taking the first pass through some of the content that I write for Groxio. And so let's establish this section here. Now I'm going to create a new section, and let's call this one Project Documentation. And the reason that I want to break this down is that I believe that LiveBook has some advantages when mixed with Elixir that go beyond just this particular scenario, the books, the blogs, and the technical writing. This is really the mechanics of writing with Elixir. This is the ability to describe a project and set someone up for success for a particular open source project. So part of what makes this scenario so powerful is the ability to lay out whole scenarios and templates in the context of an organized document where people can basically break that code out and drop it into something else. And I think that we're going to find some innovations in this area that make LiveBook easier to host and easier to use to prepare technical documentation. I don't think we've seen all the innovation here that we're going to see. A lot of it's going to be focused right here. But one of the things that's so powerful about this particular scenario is that I have this mix install that can associate an explicit document with an explicit version of code. And that's a really powerful thing. And the last scenario that I want to cover is education. And this education basically is going to be born of using prose plus code in a collaborative classroom environment. So some of the things that you see over here, like there's the keyboard shortcuts that make it easy to work with code. There are things like code completion that are nice. And then there's the ability to create individual user profiles so that different users can collaborate on the same virtual machine. We're going to talk about ways that LiveBook will shape the classroom experience. Let me start out by saying we're not going to say too much about this individual scenario, the reporting and experimenting for data. And the reason is that this is the traditional usage of LiveBook and Jupyter notebooks and the Pythons and the Julia's versions of the notebook. And I think that this is pretty well understood. But essentially, these are the features that are important, right? So this is a Markdown cell, and this is going to let us work with prose using the tools that are built for working with prose. That's Markdown. And so all that we're going to do is use Markdown to have this bullet list. And so I could have prose cells to describe intent, and then I'm going to just give me a new line, and I'm going to say I want Elixir cells to fetch and hold instance data, right? And then we could also have Elixir and JavaScript tools through components to let us visualize data. And then we could also have Elixir projects to run experiments on data. And these are things like the NX framework for dealing with numerical data in Elixir, and the Axon framework for dealing with things like machine learning using neural networks. There are a number of other things that are growing up in this area. I don't think that we need to spend a whole lot of time on them. Essentially, the concept is by mixing these two things, the code and the prose, within the context of a technical document that has a beginning, an ordering, and an end, I can have a different experience than just sharing a native project by itself. So this lets me open up Elixir to the scientist, and that's a really important thing. It's been demonstrated in many other environments, especially the Python notebooks and even the Julia notebooks and things like that. We don't really need to go over that. I think that this has been pretty well established. I think that we can move on to the next scenario. So I don't want to gloss over the idea that LiveBook is going to become an excellent tool for people who are writing books, blogs, and doing other technical writing based on the Elixir language, because the prose tools are things that we already understand. And so we have things like Markdown, so I could do a list like this. I could do a 1, 2. So that's, I can build this in Markdown, but it effectively has all of the language available to me. I could do things like Google, and that is https google.com, and now I have a link. Booble. So now I have a link, and I already know how to use these Markdown tools. I have 2 heading levels that are already built in and managed by LiveBook, and these are the first and second level headings. This is, of course, the name of the document. The second level headings are listed on the left-hand side, and I can run this in an outlining mode right here and help me organize my thoughts, or I can dive straight into Markdown. I can then use the tools in LiveBook to go ahead and export the code that I want, in either including outputs or not. And I can include them as a live Markdown or as an Elixir script. Typically, if I'm writing, I'm going to use a live Markdown format. But that allows me to quickly shape things that have both prose and Elixir and work with them. But it's also going to have the same advantages of dealing with other projects in the Elixir space. And that is, if I want to use Elixir tools like mix.install to install my dependencies, then I can go ahead and do so. And in fact, there's an article here, Let the Force Be with LiveBook, that's an excellent tool for kind of understanding what's happening under the hood with Markdown, and that's going to walk us through the mix and install, which is going to bring us to that third scenario. So if we want to use LiveBook for describing technical prose about Elixir, we can also use LiveBook very well for technical projects that need prose. And the way that I think about it is this: you have guides and reference material. The reference material should mirror the structure of the code, so you're likely going to be using the tools that Elixir builds in for the documentation. That's the module attributes and things like that, and the Elixir doc. If you're building things that need to be guides that have an English description that flows from the beginning to the end in a nice, uniform, linear way, then you're really going to be needing something like a LiveBook. So guides, LiveBook, and references, the Elixir documentation tools and hex docs and things like that. Okay, but the thing that makes this project documentation so compelling is that I can drop in an Elixir module and I can specify something that looks like this. This is a mix install. Maybe I want that JSON. So I do a mix install with a JSON. Maybe I don't need that Tesla. And maybe I want to do something like this. And I can go ahead and run that mix install, and it's going to resolve the dependency. But since I can conceivably create a document for one version, and I can create the same document that works with minor versions, I could also create a whole new document that works with a different part of the code, and it can live in a different part of the code base. It doesn't force me to play the synchronization game that keeps the documentation and the code in sync. So I can use things that are better for dealing with prose in the prose scenario, or things better dealing with code in the code scenario, and I don't have to worry as much about keeping them in sync. So the other thing that you'll typically need with a project documentation that is maybe a little bit awkward with existing tooling out there is you can build templating. So very often open source projects have many different scenarios and usage patterns, and creating these in LiveBook with multiple different classes that might be named the same way but do different things becomes very easy with this particular organization. So I think that one of the things that you're going to find is that more and more projects will start to work with Elixir's LiveBook for project documentation. Now let's talk a little bit more about what's enabling the tools enabling the books, blogs, and technical writing in the project documentation before we move on to the next section. So before I move on, I really want to talk about the idea that LiveBook is using Elixir and it's using the stack underneath to marvelous effect. So a couple of things that I mean are these. So if I create an Elixir cell here, and for example, I want to see what I have available within mix. So you can see that I'm getting mix completion here by typing tab, or if I type M, or if I type, for example, enum, I get enum, I get enumerable, and so on and so forth, but I'm getting command completion. And if I want help for these things, I could say help enum, and it's not going to give me anything in this case, but what I can do is work with the tools that are already created for Elixir. So for example, I could say include IEX dot helpers, IEX helpers like this. There it goes. I knew things were wrong because I wasn't getting the command completion like I expected. So now what I've done is I've built in include. I want import. Now what I've done is I've built in support for IEX helpers. And now what I can do is take advantage of that. So maybe if I want to say, give me help on enum.map, I can get that. Or if I need to say, what does enum export? Well, I can get that also. And what if I ask, for example, give me info on this thing? Well, I get that that thing is that the term is a thing, that is an atom, and that these are the things that I can do with it. So one of the things that I want to point out is that if you are doing technical writing, either from the standpoint of prose first or code first, you still need the tools, and you could take advantage of tools throughout the ecosystem, whether they're explicitly included or not. There are also a number of features that programmers are going to appreciate as they deal with prose and code side by side. For example, there's this menu that walks you through the different keystrokes, and one of the things you'll notice is that in the spirit of Emacs and Vim and VM, the editors that allow you to edit without moving your hands from the keyboard, there's a whole keyboard template that allows you to actually work with prose in certain ways and work with code in certain ways. And some of these are in a navigation mode, and some of those are in the insert mode. You probably recognize that if you've been using one of these editors that allows you to remain efficient by keeping your fingers in position. And you'll also notice that there are tools that allow you to be explicit about exactly which Elixir cells are executed and in which order they are. Now, you don't have to hit reload individually for all of the individual cells. You can say execute all the outdated cells if you want to, but if you need them to run in an explicit order, you can ask them to do so. And these tools are thoughtful tools for developers that you won't always find in your traditional tools for dealing strictly with prose. Now let's move on to that last scenario, dealing with individual users. Now you might ask yourself what dealing with individual users has to do with education, or really Elixir in the classroom, and I say everything. So maybe what I want to be able to do is create a user profile, and I've created one for Bruce, and maybe that looks close to Groxio Green, so I'll create that there. And then maybe there's another user, so I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to create a new tab, one with its own history, the same token though, and I'm going to say, hey, this is a different user profile. Maybe this is Katie, and maybe Katie has a different color, one something like that. So I'm going to save that, and I'm going to say that maybe what Katie wants to do is look at this scenarios file that we've been working on. And so one of the things that we can do is start asking questions. So I could say, for example, can anyone tell me how to add two strings together? And then Katie can go ahead and give that a try. So here we have, that's Bruce. So here we have Katie is working with this, and maybe Katie can answer the question. Maybe it's 1 plus 1, and that gives me 2, but that's really not string. So maybe another user can say, hey, let's give this a try. Let's say 1, 1, and then use the string concatenation plus 1 and get something like that, right? And so these users could actually collaborate, working on the same set of cells to solve a series of problems. And what I'll typically do in a classroom with several users is I'll have a couple of these problems running, and I'll let different small groupings work together on them. And this allows me to get much more engagement out of the users by presenting small bite-sized pieces that the individual users can work on. So I haven't yet shown you a lot of code. We will, but I hope I've convinced you that LiveBook is important because it's right smack in the middle of important problems, like expanding Elixir's adoption, like pushing Elixir into a new world of machine learning and the exploration of data, by making it possible to more quickly and more accurately publish content about Elixir, and by increasing Elixir's adoption by making it easy to attract users to it and show those users how to use the important new projects that are coming along. That's the promise of LiveBook, and that's really an excellent thing. For Bruce and the dog on the floor, this is Groxio Learning.